On the season finale of the PowerPLAY Show, reopenings, closings, hybrid models, all things many businesses and schools had to endure during this ongoing pandemic. But churches? And as we near the end of year 2 of COVID and its variants, how do faith leaders pivot from the traditional church to what we now know as virtual ministry? My guest co-host, Bishop Lawrence Ward of the Abundant Life Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, joins me with a panel from the faith community to discuss pivoting in year 2, next on the season finale of the PowerPLAY Show.
From the studios at Hull Bay Productions, this is the PowerPLAY.
Welcome to the season finale of the PowerPLAY Show. I'm your host, Tonya McGrath. As we embark on year 3 of this pandemic, and it's hard to imagine, we are still wearing masks, social distancing, and living on the edge of what COVID might bring. The way we work, communicate, and worship all looks very differently. On this year's season finale, we are once again asking some of our faith leaders how the faith community had to pivot in this year's pandemic. Joining me again this year is my special co-host, Bishop Lawrence Ward of the Abundant Life Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Hi, Tonya. Thank you so much for having me again on the PowerPLAY. It's great to be here with you and to talk about this very important topic and talk about what the challenges have been during this time of this pandemic. So we saw this year churches reopen and we saw churches close. We saw some churches go through a whole lot of different challenges of ministering in the pandemic. We also seen some churches who stepped into the digital space for the first time. I know for our church, Abundant Life Church, we stepped into a digital space for the first time. And others have been relying on the faithful return of people to come in person. And some, just like our Abundant Life, we had to kind of work this hybrid model. We have online church and you also had people coming in the building. But nonetheless, as a faith leader, we're still working through this process. And so church leaders are learning a great deal about new technology. They're learning about how to be able to work and connect the word and share the word online. This new variant, Delta and Omicron, really kind of had made it a little bit much more difficult because of the length of time we have been in this pandemic season. I figured that, wow, it probably might be over in a couple of months, but here we are talking about Omicron, and it's just going to be a different way of doing church. So I'm excited to talk about this great subject with faith leaders today, and it's wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, I mean, no one ever thought that we would be in this space again, a year later, particularly with the vaccinations that came out about a year ago this time. So as we near the end of year 2 of this pandemic, how do we pivot from the traditional church to what we now know as virtual ministry? Joining us is Pastor Kenneth Young of Calvary Baptist Church in Haverhill, Massachusetts, Minister Jason Green of Morning Star Baptist Church in Boston, Mass., and youth leader Darlene Reed of the Abundant Life Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome, everyone. So I think last year this time, we all thought vaccines, yay, this will all be over soon, but here we still are. Pastor Kenneth, did you ever think that we'd be discussing year 3 of a pandemic?
No, not at all, no.
And how have you been kind of like trying to wrap your brain around that? And I know that your wife is a scientist who works in the field of communicable diseases, and you probably got more of an inside track than most of us, but how are you even like managing just kind of dealing with all of this?
Just learning to take it moment by moment. I can't even do, month to month or day to day. It's a moment by moment thing. And learning to be adaptive, and even adaptive as far as leadership is concerned. Like, this is a major course in adaptive leadership. I think every leader is taking the course, whether we want it or not. And some of us are failing, and some of us are doing well, and some of us are just trying to manage, just to see our way through. But this is a major course on adaptive leadership, and I think this is what I'm feeling, and I'm sure other leaders are feeling the same thing.
And Mr. Jason, in our lifetime, did you ever think we would experience anything like this? You and I are around the same age group. I mean, did you ever think that we would be in something like this?
No. I never really thought that something like this would literally shut down the world that we understand it to be. And I think we're in the age group where I think we're considered Generation X or something like that, not millennials, Generation X. We're in that in-between age where we are old school and new school. So we are able to kind of like blend into the world of the internet, and at the same token, we know how to write letters to the one we had our first crush with, that type of thing. So to answer your question fully, I never saw this coming, and I think one of the things that was very helpful, or is very helpful, is kind of leaning on the old school side. If you're lucky, you're fortunate enough to have parents who are still alive, or aunts and uncles that are still alive, like my parents are. My dad is 82, 83. So he lived to see and survive the Depression. So when you kind of hear those type of stories and you kind of see that type of history, where he's like, well, I never seen this since the Depression, but then you hear stories about that. And if you're like a historian like myself who likes to watch old school, videos of times past, you kind of learn from those lessons that your elders have brought to you. Hopefully you learned and listened to it, and then I'm not a grandfather yet, but hopefully one day I'll probably tell my grandkids, but like, listen, you ain't seen nothing, especially what we went through in 2021, 22, and on to 2022. So yeah, that's one of those things. But no, I don't. If anyone did, they're lying. And if, unfortunately, our prophets lied to us. That's a whole different conversation.
And Darlene, you are the digital age. So you kind of grew up with the cell phones and the internet and all that stuff. But, how are you processing this? And what are you hearing from the youth that you help lead in youth ministry?
Yeah, so I'm technically a millennial. I think the teenagers or those in their 20s now are considered Gen Z. And so I grew up with changes. Adaptation is how millennials flow. We grew up with cassette players, then the CD player, then the MP3, then the iPod. So I think for us, that digital age has kind of helped us some way adapt. But I think everybody is suffering. Anxiety is up. Depression is up. We're more connected, but that deep connection people are still craving for. And so that's what I'm hearing both in my generation and the younger generation. Yes, we can contact someone very quickly. I don't have to send a letter. I don't even have to wait for email anymore. I can send a quick text. I can hit you up on social media. But a deeper connection, you can still only be surface level on those kind of connections. And so I think a lot of people are longing for a deeper connection, those that would sustain you in difficult times.
I would just relish the conversation that you all been having about what you're seeing and what you're thinking as we have come through 2020 and 2021 as well. I'm going to just kind of change it a little bit and just kind of talk about pivot. What I mean by pivot, it's kind of like we're going to be shifting into, okay, what is it like now? So Darlene, we'll start with you. We saw reopening of things happening, including churches. Restaurants started to open, retail started to open. So when you think about the reopening, particularly of our church, Abundant Life Church, what were your fears about having an in-person service?
I think my fears were kind of the same as everyone else. Can I get COVID? What does social distancing look like? Can I be safe? I'm born and raised in the Bronx, and so that was a hot spot. I experienced a lot of people who, couldn't visit family members, couldn't visit friends, and through just everyday interactions contracted COVID. So coming back into the building with those reopening, the first fear was, am I going to be safe? How are they going to track it if I am safe? But then the second was, is anybody else going to come? Will the young people come back? Will I come back? And if we do come back, we can't connect like we used to, right? So after service, you can kind of linger around, shake people's hands, give them hugs, all these kind of things that you need that you may not be getting in other spaces. And COVID kind of wiped that away. So those are probably my two biggest fears. Who's going to come back and will I be safe?
Well, that's real. Thank you. And Pastor Ken, when we think about pastoring a church, I'm sure your congregants had some serious questions and had some thoughts about that. So can you talk about a little bit some of the tough conversations that you've had with church members, and what were their concerns about returning back to worship service?
So it varied. So we had some people like, I just want to get back in. I need to get back in. And then it was, well, how do we get back in? we want you to be back in, but how do we get back in? And so I heard one leader say this, and I found it to be true. It was easy for us to say, get out. It's very hard for us to say, come back in. And so that was the conversation that we went through a lot. And it was a lot. Some people were hurt because the thing that we did, we had to limit our capacity before we even allow people back in. We tried to stream inside with just our AV team and praise and worship and myself. And then we said we want to let seniors in first because they were having difficulties with the tech. But we screened people. Some folks didn't like that. Some people said, well, we feel like you're playing favoritism, things of that nature. But my church, the demographics of my church skew older. I know people who are cancer survivors, and they had other ailments and illnesses that they were fighting off. And so I said, I don't want you to come in to worship and get sick. You survive cancer, and then you succumb to COVID. And so it has been a shift, and we pivoted to that, and we're still pivoting. I think everybody is still pivoting, and we will continue to pivot as long as this variant or new variant to come is going to be here. We'll always be changing.
Wow, that's a lot of real change and a lot of real concerns. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Pastor Green, let's talk about what's happening at your congregation. And when you're thinking about, well, where you're at now and where the congregation is now, ministry that you attend, that you're serving, what are you hearing from your congregants about reopening after being closed for several months?
Let me just say this quickly. I am an associate minister at One Star Baptist Church, where Bishop John Matthew Butters III is the senior pastor in Prelate, and the august Reverend Dorothy Smith is the assistant pastor. So I am not in the role of a senior pastor, but nonetheless, I would try to answer this question as best I can, which is the church has, in its due diligence, tried to communicate as best as they could. And I guess to echo what Pastor Young was saying, it's like it's easy to tell people leave, but hard to bring them back in. And I kind of agree with, I have a certain affinity as to what Minister Reed was saying, was just like, at least for me personally, it's a little disconcerting. Just because, we are a larger church, 2,000 plus on an easy Sunday, pre and everything like that. Now it's cut down to 300, and even last Sunday, or the Sunday that I attended, was at least 300 people. But I felt very uncomfortable, to be honest, to be quite honest with you. So, so it kind of made me kind of put inside my mind, okay, how am I going to do this? I know Bishop wants everyone to, like he was like Pastor Young was saying, he made a public appeal for people to come back to the church. I'm saying to myself, well, as part of the leadership, how does that affect me? Because, at the end of the day, I'm still a father, I'm still a husband, I'm still a son, the only son who's local to my parents. So I'm literally their strength in some capacity. If something happens to me, what happens to them? So you have to kind of be like, okay, where's the balance here? You want to be an honorable servant of the Lord and an honorable son, but at the end of the day, I'm a son first before I was a spiritual son. So it's tough because, no one talks to you about, leadership until you get to it. And I think one of my favorite commercials back in the day is like, you never let them see you sweat. I think that's the thing about leadership. It's like, you never let the people see you sweat, because if you start sweating, then the proverbial sheep start to get nervous. So I think that's moving forward in 2022 is strong leadership, but I think smart leadership.
That's very insightful about leadership. Absolutely. So Pastor Ken, when it comes to this pivot, I know Pastor Jason talked about, it's kind of like a pivotal move that you have to make. What comes to your mind when it comes to pivoting as a pastor?
Change for the future. I think that's just the best way to do it and to say it. And the reason why I'm saying it is because I'm not a native of New England, but I've been here for over a decade now. And I visited a lot of churches, and a lot of our churches are historic. A lot of our churches skew older, and that means that a lot of people want the same thing when it comes to church, even though Boston is very, very progressive outside of the church. Inside the church, not so much. And so when you have people who are longing to go back, it's almost like the children of Israel saying, like, we just want to go back to Egypt because we know we know how to make bricks. At least there were graves. The description always gets to me. At least there were graves in Egypt. Yeah. But we're in the wilderness. And we're asking, and you talk about pivoting, I think Moses and even his adaptive leadership was that he was following the direction of God. Whether it was a fire or a cloud, he was still following the direction of God. And I think every leader has to be in tune in what God is saying for their community and for their members. And, you're going to hear the whining and the moaning and the groaning of members. But when we look at that text, Moses was doing exactly what God called him to do. You need water? We'll find you some water. You want to be warm that night? He put a fire in so you can stay warm. We're going to make sure that you walk during the day, put a cloud up so the sun won't scorch your head. Mm-hmm. As long as you continue to walk in the direction that God wants you to walk in, he'll get you out of the wilderness. God will get you out of the wilderness. And I think every leader has to discern that. I think that's the part that's hard when it comes to pivoting. That leaders are having to clearly try to stay in the face of God and say, what do you want me to do for your people?
Wow.
That's awesome. That is exactly something that we definitely need to hear over and over again, is really keeping our focus on the Lord and going forward with him. So Darlene, as a youth minister, youth pastor, youth leader, and as you're leading young folks, it's hard for young people. So you talked about it a little bit already, but what does that mean for you when it comes to those whole pivoting situation?
Yeah, so it's been interesting. My youth ministry is probably slightly different from others you see function. We're more discipleship focused, and we do have big events, but the whole goal is to kind of get our students figuring out their own relationship with God and connected to a mentor or an adult who can help walk alongside them in that process. And so pivoting for us went from meeting twice or 3 times a month in person because young people love to be in a different space. I had primarily a high school ministry. Now during the pandemic, it's transitioned more towards middle school. But at that kind of age, they're just figuring out what it means to be a young adult, identity, belonging, purpose, and having a separate space away from home, away from the traditional service was super helpful to get their ideas out, to get them comfortable enough to talk about God and the things affecting them. So pivoting for us was a little difficult because the only thing we had between March, I would say, until about summertime, was Zoom. And our students were on Zoom all day for school. And so to get them on Zoom to talk about Jesus, to talk about what's going on with them, to connect with other young people was actually really difficult. Not because they had technology issues, but more so it's hard to connect talking on Zoom, especially if you're on it 7 hours a day and you have to come back after school or after work. So a lot of our transitioning meant we had to text, and we were already texting during the week, so that wasn't that hard of a transition. But in terms of building connections and building friendships, we had to go outside. By the time the summer came, we went on hikes. We were socially distanced, but we had to get outside and get them in a separate space. Sometimes the students don't feel comfortable talking about certain issues with their parents around or relatives around, or their house is so chaotic that they don't have a moment or a space for themselves. So pivoting meant going outside, utilizing Zoom, utilizing text, and then we actually had to jump on social media. We weren't on Instagram that heavy. As you know, Snapchat is probably the predominant thing for our young people. And so that's kind of where we had to connect and do challenges. A lot of our ministry, although we talked about Jesus all the time, a lot of it was addressing anxiety. A lot of it was addressing depression. A lot of it was asking them, what are you dealing with and how can we bring Jesus into that situation? So we're still ongoing in the pivot because now we're in a hybrid state where some people want to come back, some parents want to bring their kids back, others do not. And that means we do a mixture of on-person and online. And what that looks like, how that looks like is difficult. But what I'm finding is in this pivot, personal connection is probably the way that we are navigating most. Of course, like Pastor Young said, discerning what in the world the Lord wants us to do for each student, but really going, hey, I see you, I hear you, not just in the group text, but personally. And that is helping us to figure out the pivot, like literally week by week.
And I just want to jump in because I think you just nailed something so important when it comes to young people. And I have a 14-year-old at home who stayed home for a year online doing school. And it's almost like they learned how to navigate in this digital space, and everything became a connectivity virtually. And so when it was time to get back into space, relationships were a little strained. It was hard to be around your friends again. It was hard to kind of figure out boundaries in person. It was hard to figure out how to talk to people, how to behave, because those are all the adjusting years that we're talking about, the youth that you're dealing with. And so how, just having to kind of maneuver back and forth from virtual to real life and what that means, because people will say things virtually that they won't say in person, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, I just had to, because that was a huge issue for my son, just trying to manage that part out. Go ahead, Bishop.
It's interesting because sometimes I can get a bigger response in a group setting by asking them to text it to me than I could getting them to answer questions. It's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the hybrid model is something that it's just here to stay. Some churches have navigated it very well. And before the pandemic ever hit, they were actually doing online services as well as in person. But for those of us, and I say us, meaning me and Pastor Ken as well, how did you kind of, as I say, get used to riding this new way of doing church? You have people watching you on camera, and you have communications on social media, and at the same time you have an in-person service where folks are just, they're there, and you have to kind of relate to both. How's that working for you?
For me, it has been difficult at times, right? And so I will say, like, I've been blessed to be a part of Mount Zion Baptist Church in Nashville, where I was under Bishop Joseph Walker III. And, I remember clearly him saying, I believe it was 2010, and he said, listen, you're going to laugh, but there are going to be more people who are going to be watching me online and giving online than people who are going to come into the building. And this is like 2010. And so I began to see him during our fellowship time. The camera would actually go to him. He would shake hands and stuff, but that was a moment where he would actually talk to people who were streaming online. And so I was blessed to be able to see that. But trying to transition that to the church has been difficult because they never saw it and they've never seen it. And so this kind of a hybrid model, which means that there are going to be some folks that's in the building and some folks who are streaming online, has been difficult. Now, as a preacher, it's difficult because I'm used to, I grew up in a Baptist church. And so that kind of a talk back, it's hard to do when you don't have anybody to talk back to you. So you've had to learn how to talk to people if it's not but 5 or 6 people who are there, and you've had to learn how to talk to people who are streaming in online. And so that's something that I had to learn to do. Hey, put the title of the sermon in the chat. Won't you tell somebody who's in the chat to, God is going to help you get through it, to kind of create that virtual community. And that's difficult because you have been taught and trained to talk to people that you're looking at. Now you've been taught at a exponential rate to look at the camera a certain type of way, to make sure that you are indeed looking at the camera and which camera you're looking at. So, I spoke to one of my preaching professors. I said, listen, you all need a class on this because this is not going away. We don't know anything about red lights and all, one sermon I said, y'all got to let me know which camera I'm supposed to be looking at. And so that's difficult because I'm so used to making sure I'm interacting with the congregation. Now I have to make sure I interact with the congregation and interact with the virtual congregation. So in your service, in your sermon, you have to do that, but in the service, you have to do that. So I don't know if this is happening with you, Bishop, but I've been paying attention. So what happens with Calvary is that we start at 11 o'clock. And there's a few folks who come in and they want to chat and things of that nature, and that's great. But around 11:30, there's a peak, right? And that's right before the sermon. For whatever reason, you at home, but you're still late to church. And so, you have to learn, you can't change your order of service because, listen, they're at 11:30, that's when people are actually going to come in and get the service and get the sermon, right? So those things, I think we're learning on the fly. Everybody's trying to learn how to engage with those who are listening because I believe what you're saying is true. We're probably going to see, and the trend shows us that once you open up, people flood in, and then after a while, they don't even come back. So we're going to have to learn how to speak to a virtual audience more than speaking to the people who are in the seats.
Yeah, I so agree. And what I'm finding out now, as you started to mention, people coming on to virtually watch the service at whether it's 11:30 or 10:30. Some folks are not even watching it then; they're watching it on demand. They're saying, "I'm having my church on Monday, or my church on Wednesday, or my church on Thursday." So they're taking that time, whether it's with their families or they're traveling. They're not going to church on Sunday anymore. They're saying, "Okay, well, I can catch it on Tuesday night or Wednesday night." So it's definitely a challenge, and you can't have what I call the soft skin to kind of look at the numbers, because that would certainly depress you very quickly. That as you're looking at the numbers, like how many's watching today? It's like, really? Okay,
watch this, Bishop. You might be a side church.
Your fifth church.
you might be the side pastor, the side preacher. Because since we're in the virtual world, they're like, listen, I know I can catch Jamal Bryan at 9:30, or I can catch Bishop T.D. Jakes, and then I can go to my church. Or I can catch this church and then I go to my church at night because this is my community. I want to stay connected to them. So, Ed Stetzer, I believe he made the quote that this is a great resorting of people in different churches. Where people are going to land after this, we don't know. But I think what we are seeing is that some people are connected to a lot of different ministries right now. And so they may be connected to a local ministry, but they also may be connected to a national ministry, or a church that has a national brand or a worldwide brand. So it's just very interesting to see. It really is.
Yeah, it's something to behold. Absolutely. Yes. And that's a good segue. Pastor Jason, when it comes to Morning Star, What modifications have they made to really work within this whole hybrid model of church?
I would say at least for me personally, I would say it first started when this whole thing began, probably like in 2020. Bishop called for a meeting for all the leaders and everything like that, and he just said, "This is what we're going to do." I guess he had a conversation with the powers that be in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the governor, and spelled it out as to how churches needed to be closed down for, at that point, maybe like a 3 to 6 period. Who knew? So as a result, the music ministry minister, Michael Bradley, he kind of laid out a plan as to what he did reference Bishop Walker as I guess, the gold standard, if you will, as to how they were everything like that. So, and while there were those of us who had questions for various reasons, I, for one, was like, did we have the technology or the manpower to pull it off and everything like that? Others were just like, well, church is so important. You need to keep it open no matter what. It was that type of dynamic that was happening in the meeting and stuff like that. Hopefully I'm not telling tales out of school, but it was. So with that said, I think the church particularly at Morningstar has done a wonderful job, I would think, just really kind of pushing itself as a church that is, doing well in the hybrid model. I would say, I won't speak for Bishop, but Bishop will probably tell you that while he definitely would like all of us to be in a setting at one church, in one setting rather, we are doing the best we can to maintain communication, have a quality viewing experience, if you will, so that people are willing to come in and join at whatever time they is. And like Pastor Young was saying, it's like, I'm sure that might be their third or fourth service. You might be willing to watch, like I said, one enjoyed watching Bishop Walker or Brian or whatever, or Bishop Caesar in New York City or something like that, those type of things, and then I'll come on and stuff like that. So, or sometimes if I can't happen, I can do it on Monday night or Sunday evening. So I think one of the things that's I would encourage those who are feeling that they're struggling with the hybrid model. I think in this situation, our parishioners are able to enjoy, I guess what we used to do back in the day is visiting certain saints of different churches and stuff. Since that's not happening, but if churches, like say, for example, when I was at 77, it was not out of bounds to go to visit folks at 211 or 789 and stuff like that. Now that COVID has taken away, but if you have that hybrid model, you can visit different churches at a different time and stuff like that, and still be faithful to the church that you are called to serve or to support.
So I'm going to jump in now because I want to start to talk about the response to this pivoting and what that has meant for each of you. And I'll start with you, Darlene. In this pivot, pastoring and ministering has changed specifically. But for you, what have you missed or what are you missing with this new pivot? Because we can't do everything. And we can't do everything that we used to do before, as we've been hearing from Minister Jason and Pastor Ken and Bishop. So what have you been missing? And can think creatively about maybe how we can bring some of these things back into our ministry.
I think probably what's been missing are our points of connection. Just low bar, how are you doing? Can we connect over something fun? A lot of sharing the gospel is building community, and a lot of sharing what God is doing in your life is building relationships. And those little moments after church where you could check in with someone, said, hey, last week you told me about this. How's that going? Or we all go out to a group event, whether it's bowling or I do miss that. And with it being winter and the fall, it getting colder, you're more prone to go inside. And with this new variant out, it's way harder to go say, hey, let's go to a public place to hang out or a park. So I am missing those points of connection. I think some creative ways of bringing it back still have to be through video and Zoom, but it could be more creative instead of just like, hey, how are you doing? I know people who do virtual paint nights. I know people who do, virtual scavenger hunts. And so there are definitely ways to connect and build community. But I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've been missing. And I know definitely some of the young people and my friends have been missing, because there's nothing like catching up with somebody. And of course you can do it through text and email. Those never get missed, but there's something about in-person kind of connections that, definitely is missing.
Yeah, I was trying to coordinate a yoga day for Abundant Life Church in the summertime, and that just didn't happen. But Pastor Ken, you touched on this briefly. You talked about, the ability to reach a certain part of your congregation that may not technically be able to adhere to the hybrid model. How are you managing that? How are you reaching those who either are not technically savvy or those who may not be able to afford to watch online? How are you handling those congregants?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think every pastor is trying to figure that one out, right? We still have a conference call line, even though, we've been in this for almost 2 years now. We still have some people just like, yeah, I'm not going to do Facebook, or I'm not going to do YouTube, but I will call in. And so that's a part of it. We still have prayer. We have a prayer call that people are calling into for those who are not, technically savvy. And so those, I think, are the ways, because people use their phones, even if you're older, you know how to call somebody. So people use their phones, and those are the ways that we've been trying to connect. But we're doing stuff outside. I mean, we had our Christmas Eve service outside. So the more, it was freezing, and we had heaters out there, and we had hot cider and the cocoa. We tried to make it as winter wonderland as we could, but it was outdoors. Some people loved it. But those are the ways that we've been trying to connect, to make sure that we can do things and gather together. Now, on the flip side of that, even though you haven't asked the question yet, I'm going to answer. Some of us don't have large sanctuaries. And so we're running into issues of how we gather because of that. And I will say, we are trying to figure that one out, because if we're going to do the protocols, it limits the amount of people that we're going to be able to have inside our sanctuary.
Yeah, that's certainly a consideration. And, the mask mandate, I know that people are tired of wearing masks, but, I know at Abundant Life Church, we're still continuing to do that. And we've also re-implemented the contact tracing as these variants continue to get spread. And I think people are just kind of tired of it. Minister Jason, are you hearing that folks are just, it's not even worth it. I'm tired. I'm just going to stay home because I just don't feel like going through all of that. Church is where I'm supposed to be able to be myself and be loved and just be free. And you can't do that in this era.
Well, I can't necessarily say I've heard it, but I'm sure I've seen it. Actions speak louder than words, as we like to say. So I would say that, for many people, I think for them, it's easier for them to say, well, you know what, I'm just going to stay home and be, as we used to say back in the day, part of the bedside Baptist church, where you're just watching at home or stuff like that, or you listen to the radio and stuff. I think for them, as Minister Reed said so well, was that, we are a church that is, as a church, we are relational. We want to, pass the peace and, shoot the fat before and after church and stuff like that. Now that COVID has pretty much taken away that part of our service, so to speak. People are just feeling kind of isolated, and as a result, it's like, well, if I can't necessarily do the things that I was accustomed to doing for the past 20, 30, 40 plus years at church, I might as well just stay home, get that hour and a half service and just keep it sliding. and everything like that. So, and I give props to that people for those, because in many ways they keep themselves safe as well as others from perhaps
Right.
Connecting. Because let's just be real, a lot of people want to come to church and they are going to church, but they are not vaccinated. But they may stretch the truth and stuff like that. So you don't know really who is who's what in that situation. So sometimes, like even my parents, it's like, listen, we want to go to church, but you just don't flat out trust folks. So they just say it flat out. So my feeling is like, can't blame you on that situation. So as much as one want to come to church and everything like that, and they're probably frustrated, but I think at the same token, there's reasons behind their frustration. They have to give space and rest.
Quick question, just a yes or no. Do you think that churches should be asking for vaccination cards to come to church?
Yeah, we asked. We're trying to figure out a protocol for those who are not, but because we had seniors who were going in first, we wanted to make sure that people who went in were vaccinated. Yeah.
Darlene?
I think you should ask, but not force it on people.
Bishop? And then you're going to take over.
I think the jury's kind of a little bit out for me in that how do we do it? And I think it's very important that we know that we're protecting everyone. And what's the legalities of that? I'm not too sure. How does that impact people to come? I'm not sure. And I think it's I'm going to ask the question such as if you're vaccinated, put it down. If you've been exposed, definitely let us know. Whether they have to show a COVID, card or not, or can't come in, that's still, I think the jury's a little bit out for me.
All right.
So 2022, we are just some days away from the crossing over into a new year. So when you're starting to think about faith in moving forward with the Lord, as Pastor Ken, you were talking about following God, what faith messages can you share with the audience of how you plan to minister to people in this coming year?
Well, Sunday, I preached Psalm 31-5, and in the end it says, weeping may endure, we may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. And so the title of the sermon was Endure the Night. And I think that is what we are going to have to do, this sense of endurance and being resilient for the night, right? Joy is still coming, but we have to endure this moment, this time that we're in. And so I think that for us, that's something that we're going to have to understand. What does the endurance look like during the night? It may mean that there's a lot of changes. There may be a lot of times we're going to ask people to be flexible until we get to this point of joy that morning and seeing that sun rise again. I do think we're going to get there. I don't know when, but I don't understand how long it's going to take for us to get there. And so I also told a story about my baby girl who was saying, "Daddy, I'm taking a nap, but the sun's going down." It seems like it's I don't want it to get dark. I said, this is around winter solstice. This is the longest night. And so sometimes it seems like we are in a long night. But I told her, I said, you know what? I said, the sun is going to come back up again. In the morning, it's going to come back up. It never stops. And so I think for Christians, we have to know that there are some times where it seems like we're going through that longest night, but we have to have inside of us this sense of knowing that joy is going to come again, right? That morning is going to come again. And so that's the hope and the prayer that, and the word that I'm trying to spread to my people. And so going into 2022 for our church is going to be reboot. We're going to reboot. And I think all of us have to do that individually, but collectively. Some things that we thought was going to work, it's not going to work. Right? We're going to have to reset and reassess a lot of different things. And I think that happens in the rebooting process. And we see that in Nehemiah, where he goes and he is rebooting it's a reassessment of everything, right?
Yep.
The way you was worshiping wrong, you didn't even know the word, all of this, we got to rebuild. I think that's what we're going through, not only as a church individually, or even, personally, we're going through that. But when we look at the church across, the nation, we'll just use America. It was time for us to redo some things. A lot of us are we're seeing success in a lot of areas because we said we're going to actually spread the gospel. And I'll say this, we did a lot of worship outdoors. It was a lot of people. We are 150 years old this year, Bishop. It was a lot of people that didn't even know our church exists in the area until we start doing worship outside. And people who were walking by was like, oh, I needed this word today. I needed to hear people praying for me, And so I think what we are seeing is that the church is in a rebooting process where we had to learn how not to do church, but actually be the church outside the four walls of the building.
That's good. That's good. It is time that we be the church. And so, Jason, what are your hopes for the new year?
My hope for the church is the same. Well, again, not as a senior pastor, but my personal hope for myself and for the church is that we empower ourselves. I think this past 2 years has been tough, but I would say, honestly, the last 6 years has been tough. I would say that COVID has struck us down, but by the fact that the former occupant of the Oval Office is no longer in power, but mindset of the people is still there. January 6th is happening next year, very soon. And I think for us personally as a church, we got to deal with a lot of sickness in and outside of the and that we have to basically inoculate ourselves, not from COVID, but from a lot of the outside entities that has attacked the church and society. Racism, colorism, sex, those type of things that really has yet to be addressed after over 2,000 years of the church has not been fully recognized or addressed, and over 200 years in this country that has not been addressed. So those are the things that I would hope that in 2022, that we, as we continue to figure this thing out, we answer some questions that need to be addressed.
That's great. That's awesome. And Darlene, what are your hopes for 2022?
My personal hope is to deepen my love walk and how I love people and how I love people well. But my hope for the church in 2022 is that we be the church in ways that are unconventional. I think teaching people well how to let the Holy Spirit lead in their personal lives, and so that they can make an impact on the world. That's my hope for the church, that we would lose some of the things we held fast to that actually were tradition. And we didn't realize it because we were doing it for so long, and that we would, not be so caught up in language and or tradition, but really be intentional about how we connect and relate to people. So my hope is that, is it Isaiah 61:3, where that, for the spirit of heaviness, that we can have this garment of praise, but not that we just wear it, but wherever we go, we can be that light that goes, wait a second, we're in year 3 of the pandemic. How in the world are you still sounding hopeful and being hopeful? And it's because, we have access to a source. So my hope is that we be the church, but that we're that sprinkle of light, that anywhere that there's heaviness, we can bring the Spirit of God and really hope to enlighten people to a source where they can connect to and have the energy, the strength, the ability to endure, to adapt, and to kind of live and dream again. So.
Well, I just want to thank you all for this really, really important conversation. I love that I end the season with really just talking about faith and what everyone's walk is and what our purpose is. And as hard as this last year has been and the year before that, I can rely on people like you, our faith and community leaders, to continue to just, have that hope that we will one day see this through and we will be better. We'll be better. So Pastor Kenneth Young of Calvary Baptist Church, Minister Jason Green of Morning Star, and of course, our youth leader, Darlene Reed. Thank you all for this important discussion on faith and life in the COVID era. And a very special thanks to my co-host again this year, Bishop Lawrence Ward of the Abundant Life Church. I pray for your continued leadership and guidance in this new year, and may it be a new year of healing, growing, and reconnecting.
Well, it has been such a delight to be part of this finale of the Power Play with you, Tonya, and with so many of the faith leaders that are here with us. And it's great to talk about this subject. What I'd just like to just share with the audience as we would leave you, that as we're going into 2022, as a leader, I really believe that leaders have to take the high road. And when I say the high road, I mean the road that really we do what is best for what God wants us to do, and also do the best we can for our people, do the best we can for our families. There is a poem that was written by Kevin Keith, and it talks about the paradoxical commandment. And the paradoxical commandment is just simply that there's going to be people who are illogical and unreasonable and self-centered, so you have to love them anyway. If you do good, people are going to accuse you, and sometimes they're going to be selfish and have ulterior motives, but do good anyway. If you're successful and you win false friends and have true enemies, you just got to succeed anyway. The good you do today may be forgotten tomorrow, so it's important that you do good anyway. And honesty and frankness are going to make you vulnerable, so be honest and frank anyway. And the biggest men and women with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest men and women with the smallest minds. So you have to think big anyway. And people favor underdogs, but follow the top dogs. And so as leaders, we have to fight for the underdogs anyway. And what we do, we're going to have to spend years as leaders building and trying to do the best we can to build ministry and build churches and build families. And it could be destroyed overnight, but it's important that you build anyway. And finally, people really need help. And they may attack you if you help them, but you need to help them anyway. And so it's important that we take the high road. And the high road is going to have a hill. And I still think we're going to be going up a little bit of a hill for some time, but take the high road. So thank you so much. And I pray that this year will be a year where God will give you strength, God will give you courage, God will give you the tenacity to take the high road. That's what I would say as a leader.
Well, thank you, Bishop. That was incredible and very inspiring, and I will take that with me in 2022. Remember, you can listen to past episodes of the PowerPLAY Show wherever you subscribe to podcasts, including iTunes, iHeartRadio, and now Amazon Music. You can also watch us on our YouTube channel. Simply search the Hull Bay Productions Media channel, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we air each and every Saturday at 5 p.m. on BroncoEyeRadio.com. So tune into the PowerPLAY Show each Thursday for a new episode, and our season premiere coming up next week, wherever you subscribe to podcasts, including all these streaming platforms that I mentioned before, or on our YouTube channel by searching the Hull Bay Productions Media channel, or you can simply visit our website at thepowerplayshow.com. Until next year on the PowerPLAY Show, I'm your host, Tonya McGrath. Have a happy and safe New Year, everyone.